8 hours into the interrogation, the detectives were running out of options. They had confronted Grant Amato with photographs of his dead family. They had pressed him about his changing timeline. They had even claimed to possess surveillance footage, fingerprints, and other evidence that they did not actually have, hoping the pressure would cause him to reveal something. But Grant would not confess. So detectives brought in the only person left who might be able to reach him, his older brother, Jason. Jason has spent much of his adult life outside the family home. Now, in this space of a single day, his mother, father, and brother Cody were dead. Grant was the only person who had been living in that house who was still alive. He told Grant that their parents had protected him. They had chosen not to report the thefts. They had tried to keep the situation within the family. And that Cody had even offered to pay money Grant allegedly owed their relatives. Jason needed to know what had happened. He needed to know those as a son and as a brother, and as the last member of a family that had existed only days earlier. Grant said he didn't know. Eventually, Jason stood to leave. Before he did, he told Grant something that would later become one of the most haunting sentences in this case. Nobody loved you any more or any less. That sentence contains the central contradiction of the Amato family murders. Grant's family had repeatedly tried to help him. They continued housing him. They absorbed enormous financial losses. They chose not to report the thefts to police. They arranged treatments. They gave him another opportunity to remain at home under strict conditions. Then they finally established a boundary. The prosecution argued that Grant turned against his family when their protection became a boundary. The jury would later find him guilty of murdering all three. This case is often reduced to a sensational headline. A man spent nearly $200,000 on a webcam performer, then murdered his family. But that headline gives the screen too much power. It makes the crime sound as though it began with a woman in Bulgaria. Well, I think it did not. It began with a growing system of deception, with professional collapse, with financial exploitation, with a person constructing an identity he could not afford, and with a family gradually realizing that love could no longer mean protecting him from every consequence. This is the story of Grant Tiernan Amato, and more importantly, it is the story of Chad, Margaret, and Cody Amato. 3 people who spent months trying to stop the destruction of their family. 3 people whose lives were brutally taken inside their own home. And 3 people who, according to prosecutors, were then arranged as characters in one final lie. How could someone destroy the people whose love had been demonstrated repeatedly in order to preserve a connection sustained through payment? Before there were detectives, crime scene photographs, and courtroom arguments, there were horses. Margaret Amato loved them. According to people interviewed for the Law and Crime documentary, she fostered former racehorses that had been mistreated. She also spent time introducing neighborhood children to horses, sharing something she loved with people around her. Chad Amato was a clinical pharmacist and an enthusiastic football fan. He enjoyed taking his sons to games. The family lived in Chuluota, a rural community in Seminole County, beyond the tourist image usually associated with Central Florida. Jason was the eldest son. He eventually married, started his own family, and moved out, while the other two sons, Cody and Grant, remained at home. The two brothers were close in age by accounts presented in documentaries. They were almost inseparable. They participated in weightlifting together in high school. They played paintball. They played video games, watched anime. They talked about traveling to Japan, then eventually made that trip together. Grant reportedly admired Cody and followed him into nursing. Both brothers pursued careers in healthcare. Cody established himself as a nurse. Grant also became a nurse and later entered training connected to nurse anesthesia. For a time, the structure of Grant's life appeared familiar and more or less mundane. Family, education, work, a professional future, a brother he looked up to, and parents who continued supporting him into adulthood. Then in 2018, that structure began to collapse. Grant worked as a nurse at a healthcare facility in Orlando. In 2018, he was accused of taking and improperly administering medication from the hospital. He lost his job. Whatever the eventual legal outcome of that separate allegation, the professional consequences were immediate. Grant was no longer working. His future in nursing had become uncertain. He remained in the family home, now unemployed and without a stable daily structure. The loss was larger than a paycheck. A profession can become part of how a person understands himself. Grant had trained for a respected career. His brother Cody was still working successfully in healthcare. Grant, meanwhile, was unemployed and dependent. We cannot know exactly how Grant experienced that contrast, but the change in his behavior is documented. He spent more time online. He returned to gaming. Unfortunately, he also began consuming adult content. Then he encountered a Bulgarian webcam model known as Silvie. During his interrogation, Grant initially seemed embarrassed to explain what he had been doing online. Her name is Silvia Venceslavova, commonly referred to as Silvie. Unlike pre-recorded adult content, a live webcam platform allows interaction. A customer can send messages, purchase tokens, pay for private performances, send gifts, request personalized content, and receive attention that appears to respond directly to him. Grant did not describe the connection as merely intimately amorous or sensual. He said it felt like a relationship. It is important to remember this because the service was commercial, but Grant appears to have experienced the interaction as emotionally reciprocal. He sent Silvie lingerie. He sent her clothing and adult toys. He reportedly sent flowers and other gifts. He paid for increasingly private and explicit interactions. According to a documentary's reconstruction, Grant was spending between $1,000 and $2,000 on some days. In one recording, he pleaded with Silvie to send him a video rather than making him purchase it. His language sounded less like that of a casual customer and more like someone asking a romantic partner for reassurance. The relationship offered him something that his life outside the screen no longer provided. Online, he could appear successful, generous, affluent, desirable. He could be someone with enough money to spend thousands of dollars for another person's attention. However, there was only one problem. That version of Grant Amato did not exist. It had to be financed. When detectives asked Grant how much he believed he had spent, he estimated close to $200,000. They asked where the money had come from. Grant acknowledged that it had come from his own resources, then from Cody, and then from his father. But the financial damage reportedly extended beyond simply borrowing money. According to news sources, Grant ran up bills on family credit cards. He forged signatures. He allegedly obtained a fraudulent line of credit connected to his parents' mortgage. Chad ultimately refinanced the family home and absorbed part of the loss despite being close to retirement. It was reported that Grant had taken money connected to his aunt, grandmother, and cousins. Cody reportedly offered to help repay those relatives. That detail says something important about the family. The family were not standing at a distance condemning Grant while refusing to help. They were absorbing the damage. Chad took the financial loss. Cody offered to pay debts he had not created. The family did not immediately report Grant to the police. They tried to contain the crisis within the family. Perhaps they believed that exposing Grant to criminal charges would destroy his future completely. Perhaps they believed treatment could still work. Or maybe perhaps they thought the person they knew was still penetrable. Those possibilities are understandable, but the available record does not allow us to know precisely what each family member thought. What we do know is that their decision to handle the matter privately did not stop Grant's conduct. Once the family understood the scale of the spending and deception, they issued an ultimatum. Grant would enter treatment. He would stop communicating with Silvie. He would begin rebuilding his life. His parents sent him to a private mental health facility in South Florida. The program was reportedly intended to last approximately 2 months and address his obsessive online behavior, pornography use, and reported depression. However, Grant stayed for fewer than 2 weeks. After he returned, Chad and Margaret met him at a restaurant and established rules for remaining in the family home. Grant was expected to find work. He was expected to stop spending most of his time online. He was expected to apologize to members of the family. And more importantly, he was never to contact Silvie again. The family had reached the point where support required conditions. Grant returned home under those conditions, but he later resumed contact. According to reports, Grant persuaded Margaret to allow him to use her phone so he could speak with Silvie again. That was not an accidental violation. He knew the condition. He knew what was at stake. He also knew how his father would respond if the contact was discovered. Grant later told detectives that Chad warned him that if he contacted Silvie again, he would be removed from the house. On January 24, 2019, Chad discovered that Grant had done exactly that. He ordered Grant to pack his belongings and leave. During the interrogation, Grant described the confrontation as threatening. He claimed Chad told him that if he returned to the property, he would kill him. Grant also alleged that Chad had recently become volatile and had behaved aggressively toward Margaret. Those were Grant's allegations. Therefore, they should not be treated as independently verified descriptions of the family home. However, they became part of the story Grant presented to the detectives. According to Grant, he was afraid of his father. According to prosecutors, however, it was Chad, Margaret, and Cody who were in danger. The ultimatum on January 24 did not simply remove Grant from a house. It threatened the system that had sustained his online identity. Without his family, he would lose shelter. He would lose access to money, access to credit, and protection from immediate legal consequences. And perhaps most importantly to him, he would lose the ability to continue presenting himself to Silvie as someone with resources. This final point remains an interpretation of the evidence, not a proven description of his private thoughts. One neighbor later testified to hearing several gunshots during the evening. Other testimony raised questions about sounds heard the next morning. The exact order and timings of the killings remained disputed. What is not disputed is what deputies discovered on January 25. Cody was expected at work. When he did not arrive, a co-worker became concerned and requested a well-being check. Deputies went to the Amato residence. Nothing outside clearly explained what had happened within. There was no obvious forced entry. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Inside, deputies found 3 bodies. Margaret was at her desk, where investigators believe she had been working. Chad was in the kitchen. His lunch bag was nearby, giving detectives the impression that he had recently come home. Cody was near the doorway leading from the garage, as though he had also just entered the house. All 3 had been found having penetrating head trauma, execution style. Detectives were looking at a family apparently frozen during ordinary moments. Margaret was working, Chad was arriving home, Cody entering through the garage. The positions suggested routine, and the gunfire had interrupted it. Then investigators noticed details that did not make sense. A pistol had been positioned near Cody. A second gun was in a holster on Chad's body. But the holster appeared to be placed backward for a right-handed shooter. 4 cartridge casings were positioned around the victims, corresponding to the number of gunshot wounds described by prosecutors. The scene appeared to be offering investigators a story. Cody and Chad had confronted one another. Cody had killed his parents. Then Cody killed himself. But the evidence seems to refuse to cooperate. The bullets recovered from the victims were not fired from the handgun beside Cody, and the murder weapon was not found. The scene did not look like the uncomplicated murder followed by suicide that prosecutors believe it had been designed to suggest. Prosecutors would later argue that Grant had attempted to frame the brother he had once followed into nursing, traveled with, and described as the person closest to him in the world. If that interpretation had succeeded, Cody would have lost more than his life. he would have been remembered as the person who murdered his own parents. One person who lived in the house was missing: Grant. His car was also gone. Investigators located him at a nearby hotel. When officers first approached him, they placed him in handcuffs. After determining that he was cooperative, they removed them. Grant agreed to accompany detectives to the Seminole County Sheriff's Office. Nothing obvious physically connected him to the crime scene, since there was no blood on his clothing, no blood inside his car, no murder weapon was recovered from him. There were no eyewitnesses who had seen him fire a gun. But these absences would later become central to the defense. And at that stage, Grant was not yet under arrest for murder. At that stage, he was still a family member being asked to explain why he was alive, why he was at a hotel, and what had happened before he left the house. But Grant's answers did not satisfy investigators. So what happened inside that house? Grant admitted that he had argued with his dad, Chad. He told detectives that his father had forced him to leave and threatened him if he returned. But he insisted that once he left, he never went back. When detectives suggested that something might have happened during the confrontation, Grant continued saying that he did not know. He eventually acknowledged that he had left the house later than he first claimed. Detectives also found his response to the welfare check information unusual. According to one investigator, Grant did not immediately ask whether his parents and Cody were safe. When asked what he thought might have happened inside the house, Grant suggested there may have been a shooting involving Cody and Chad. Why would Cody shoot their father? Grant proposed that Cody might have acted to protect him. This suggestion drew investigators' attention because a handgun had been positioned near Cody's body, and prosecutors would later argue that the scene had been arranged to implicate him. Although this did not prove Grant staged the scene, but to investigators it was another detail that did not sit comfortably, so they began applying more pressure. Detective Eva Marie Multari initially attempted a calm, sympathetic approach. She told Grant that honesty might allow them to help him. She suggested that perhaps there had been an argument, an accident, or an act of self-defense. Grant continued denying knowledge of the murders. On the other hand, Detective Daniel Anderson became more confrontational. He demanded to know who had left Grant's family in that condition. He pointed to Grant's depression, debts, and confrontation with Chad. Still, Grant did not confess. The detectives then used deceptions. They claimed there was surveillance showing what happened. They implied they possessed fingerprints and forensic evidence connecting him to the scene. Those claims were interrogation tactics, not accurate descriptions of evidence they possessed at the time. However, the tactics produced no confession. Hours passed. Grant remained controlled and withdrawn. Although demeanor is not proof of guilt, people process shock, accusation, and grief differently. But the detectives believed Grant was withholding information. After approximately 8 hours, they tried something unusual. They brought in Jason. Jason had already been ruled out as a suspect. Investigators could account for his location during the relevant period. he was not near the Amato home. They hoped he might obtain what trained interrogations could not: an honest answer from his brother. Jason entered the room carrying grief, suspicion, and guilt. He told Grant that he wanted to believe him. But he also knew what had happened during the preceding months. Jason knew about the thefts. He knew about the family's effort to protect Grant. He knew that their parents could have reported him and allowed him to face criminal charges. Instead, they tried to resolve the matter privately. Jason said he needed closure. He needed to know what happened to his mother, father, and Cody. He also spoke about the pain of not being there to help them. Grant continued saying that he did not know. Jason could not obtain a confession. Before leaving, he told Grant that he loved him. He reminded that Chad, Margaret, and Cody had loved him too. Nobody loved you any more or any less. The brothers embraced. Jason left, while Grant remained silent. Detectives did not yet have enough to hold him. He walked out of the sheriff's office, but investigators continued checking his story, and the digital trail was beginning to tell a different one. According to prosecutors, after leaving the family home, Grant went to a supermarket parking lot. During the early morning hours, reportedly between 3 and 4 o'clock, he logged into the Webcam platform again. He spent approximately $599 communicating with Silvie. That activity created an obvious question. Chad has supposedly expelled Grant from the home and cut him off financially. So where did the money come from? Investigators found one of Chad's credit cards among Grant's belongings. Prosecutors also presented a more disturbing piece of financial evidence at trial. They argued that after Chad was dead, Grant used his father's finger to unlock his phone through its fingerprint identification system. The state said Chad's banking application was then accessed. An account was added for transferring funds. The account added was Grant's personal checking account. No one witnessed Grant physically use Chad's finger. This was the prosecution's reconstruction based on the condition of the body, the phone access, and the banking activity. The state presented it as evidence that whoever accessed the phone knew Chad was dead and was willing to use his body to continue a financial transaction. The family had attempted to cut off the money sustaining Grant's online identity. The prosecution argued that the murders removed the people who controlled that access. After detectives examined his timeline, finances, and behavior, Grant was arrested on 3 counts of first-degree premeditated murder. The prosecution faced a serious problem. The murder weapon had never been found. There was no blood on Grant. No blood was found in his vehicle. No eyewitness placed a gun in his hand. So basically, the physical crime scene did not directly identify him through blood, DNA, or a recovered firearm. The case would therefore depend heavily on circumstantial evidence. But, okay, circumstantial evidence or circumstantial does not mean imaginary. It means the conclusion is built by combining facts rather than by producing a witness who saw the act occur. The state's case rested on accumulation that 1. Grant had lost his job. He had spent nearly $200,000. he had taken money and credit from his family. His family had intervened. 5, he had violated their conditions. Chad expelled him from the home. Then 3 members of the household were murdered. The scene appeared staged to blame Cody, and Grant was absent. The murder weapon was missing. Family financial accounts were accessed posthumously. Grant allegedly spent hundreds of dollars on Silvie within hours. The prosecution argued that these facts formed one coherent explanation: that Grant killed the people who had ended his access to the life he was trying to preserve. Maybe that was the state's theory of motive. The jury's verdict established that Grant committed 3 premeditated murders, separately determined every aspect of his internal psychological reasoning. And the defense argued that a coherent story was not the same as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So, what's the prosecution's story then? During opening statements, prosecutors Stuart Stone told jurors that Grant had staged a murder followed by suicide. The state argued that the handgun near Cody and the cartridge casings had been positioned to correspond with the wounds. The bullets that killed the victims did not come from the weapon beside Cody. The gun holstered on Chad appeared to have been placed backward on the body, inconsistent with how a right-handed person would ordinarily carry it. The prosecution also presented evidence concerning Chad's phone and bank account. Then it explained the motive. Grant's parents had discovered his relationship with Silvie and the enormous amount of money he was spending. They had contacted her, and they had tried to end the relationship. To the prosecution, Grant believed his family had ended his world. You may say that the state's language may be dramatic. The underlying argument is simple. The murders were not caused by Silvie. Prosecutors argued that they were caused by Grant's reaction to losing access, money, status, and control. So given this, let's talk about the defense's story. Grant's attorneys focused on what the state could not show. That 1, the murder weapon was missing. There was no blood on Grant's clothing. No blood was found in his car. There was no DNA evidence placing him in contact with the bodies during the shootings. And no one saw him commit the murders. The defense also argued that although Grant had experience with guns, he had sold his firearm to obtain more money for his online activity. His attorneys acknowledged tension between Grant and Chad, but they questioned the alleged motive for killing Margaret and Cody, because Grant had been especially close to them. Why kill the mother who had allowed him to contact Silvie through her phone? Why kill the brother he admired, traveled with, and described as his closest companion? The defense also attacked the interrogation. Detective Anderson acknowledged that he had made false claims about surveillance and other evidence to provoke a response. The defense argued that investigators had focused on Grant too quickly and interpreted everything he did through an assumption of guilt. At trial, jurors were allowed to submit questions. Several questions concerned Jason. Why had he not been questioned in the same manner? Had investigators examined his finances? Could his emotional conversation with Grant have been an attempt to frame him? Investigators responded that they had verified Jason's location and established that he was nowhere near Chuluota during the probable time of the murders. The jurors' questions nevertheless showed that the defense had created at least some uncertainty about the investigation. Grant considered testifying, but his attorneys ultimately advised against it. The jury had already seen hours of his interrogation. Putting him on the witness stand would expose him to cross-examination. So the defense rested without Grant personally addressing the jury. Courtroom observers described Grant as generally controlled during the trial. There were two notable exceptions. He appeared emotional when photographs of his family's bodies were displayed, and when an image of Silvie appeared on the courtroom screen, observers said his attention became fixed upon it. The prosecution used that reaction in closing arguments. They suggested the jurors had witnessed the depths of Grant's fixation for themselves. However, the defense avoided discussing Silvie in its final argument. Instead, it returned to the absence of physical evidence. How could Grant have shot 3 people in a bloody crime scene without leaving blood on himself, his belongings, or his vehicle? Where was the gun? Where was the DNA? The state carried the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense argued that suspicion, theft, lies, and obsession were not substitutes for physical proof. The jury deliberated for much of the day. Then it returned. On July 31, 2019, Grant Amato was found guilty of the first-degree premeditated murder of Margaret Amato, Chad Amato, and Cody Amato. The case then moved to a second question. Should Grant die for what the jury had concluded he had done? During the penalty proceedings, prosecutors called Jason to describe the loss. Jason spoke about the memories that could never be repeated and new memories that could never be made. He said one of the things he missed the most was hearing his mother's voice. He wanted the court to know that Chad, Margaret, and Cody had been extraordinary people. When Jason finished, Grant's defense attorney asked him to return to the witness stand. The attorney asked one question. After everything that had happened, did Jason still love his brother? Jason answered yes. That one word captured the impossible position in which Grant had left him. Jason had lost 3 members of his family. A jury had found that Grant was responsible, yet Grant remained his brother. Love had survived, but trust had not. The jury did not unanimously recommend death. On August 12, 2019, Grant Amato received 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. His convictions were later affirmed on appeal. He remains in the custody of the Florida prison system. So basing on the case and the reported accounts by news outlets in the trial, is this considered family-side? The Amato murders do not fit the narrow academic definition of family-side. Traditional family-side research usually concerns a person who kills a spouse or a former spouse and 1 or more children. Grant did not kill a partner and children. He killed his parents and his older brother. The most precise factual description is maybe an intrafamilial multiple homicide, but classification does not end the discussion. The case can still be examined within the broader framework of family annihilation, because Grant was convicted of killing nearly every member of the household in which he lived. The murders occurred inside the family home. They followed an escalating crisis involving money, dependence, deception, status, and the threat of exclusion from the household. Prosecutors also argued that the crime scene was altered to redirect blame toward another member of the family. What makes this case unusual is Grant's position within that household. Many family annihilation cases involve a husband or father who occupies the role of provider, authority figure, or head of the family. Grant occupied the opposite role. He was an adult-dependent son. He was living in his parents' home. His family was absorbing his financial losses. They were attempting to protect him from legal consequences, and they were trying to interrupt behavior they believed had become destructive. According to the prosecution, the crisis reached its breaking point when that support became conditional and Grant was ordered to leave. This raises the possibility of a less conventional form of family annihilation, not one driven by a provider's belief that he had failed his family, but one driven by an adult dependent's inability to accept the loss of access, support, and control. Still, we should be careful with the language used to explain that behavior, because Grant was sent to a treatment facility intended to address his online sexual behavior, pornography use, depression, and fixation on Silvie. He spent extraordinary amounts of money. He continued contacting her despite treatment and household restrictions. He lied about spending. He used money and credit belonging to relatives. These behaviors may resemble compulsive or addiction-like patterns, but there is no publicly available official record establishing that Grant was clinically diagnosed with an addiction. Therefore, we can't verify that Grant's addiction had solely caused the murders. Maybe we can state that Grant's compulsive online behavior and an intense parasocial attachment formed part of the circumstances surrounding the crime. The term parasocial interaction was originally developed to describe the way an audience member may experience a media figure as though a genuine social relationship exists. The person on the screen can begin to feel familiar, emotionally available, personally significant. Research on celebrity worship and fandom has also explored how these attachments can become obsessive or pathological in a minority of cases. Most parasocial attachments are harmless. They may provide entertainment, comfort, motivation, or a sense of connection. For some people, however, the attachment may intensify isolation, interfere with real relationships, or become emotionally consuming. Grant's connection with Silvie had an additional feature. It was interactive and monetized. The more money he spent, the more access and personalized attention he received. That structure may have strengthened his perception that the relationship was reciprocal. Grant himself said that it felt like a real relationship. He sent gifts. He paid for private interactions. He described Silvie as his girlfriend. And he continued pursuing contact even after the financial damage had been exposed. This does not warrant that Grant suffered from a clinical addiction. I would say, as a person who is not a professional, These information does not warrant that Grant suffered from a clinical addiction. It does not establish that parasocial attachment inevitably leads to violence, and it does not make Silvie or the platform responsible for the murders. Millions of people form attachments to performers, creators, celebrities, and fictional characters without harming anyone. The important distinction is that Grant's attachment existed alongside deception, compulsive spending, financial exploitation, professional collapse, and a growing refusal to accept boundaries. The parasocial relationship did not create the violence itself. It became part of a larger system. Money purchased attention. Attention reinforced the perceived relationship. The perceived relationship justified further spending. When Grant's own money was gone, family resources sustained the cycle. When the family tried to stop it, they threatened both his access to Silvie and the identity he had created around that access. One possible interpretation is that the final ultimatum represented more than eviction. It meant losing the financial and emotional structure supporting the life he had constructed online. We cannot know with certainty whether Grant experienced that loss as humiliation, abandonment, punishment, or personal destruction. What it does show is that the family's intervention, the loss of financial access, and the threatened end of contact with Silvie immediately preceded the murders. The prosecution argued that these circumstances supplied the motive. The jury concluded that Grant committed 3 premeditated killings. So the Amato case may be understood as an atypical form of family annihilation, shaped by financial dependence, obsessive attachment, compulsive behavior, and the collapse of a fabricated identity. I'm not saying that this is a formally established understanding, nor should it be understood as proof that fandom behavior, webcam platforms, or parasocial relationships cause murder. In my understanding, the danger in this case was not just attachment alone. It was attachment combined with entitlement, compulsion and obsession combined with access to other people's money, and dependence combined with resentment, and an apparent belief that the people setting the limits had become responsible for the collapse of the life Grant wanted to preserve himself. It is tempting to mock Grant for believing he had a real relationship with a woman he had never met in person. Mocking him may be emotionally satisfying, but it may not be useful. As we know, the connection was commercial, and most especially transactional. But the emotion Grant attached to it appears to have been genuine. A person does not need the other party to share an attachment for the attachment to influence behavior. The important distinction is not between real and unreal emotion, but between reciprocal and one-sided relationships. Silvie interacted with Grant because he was a customer. Grant appeared to have interpreted the interaction as evidence of something intimate. The more money he spent, the more access he received. The more access he received, the more valuable the connection may have felt. And the more valuable it felt, the more he needed money to preserve it. This created a closed system. Money purchased attention. Attention reinforced the relationship. The relationship justified more spending. When Grant exhausted his own money, he moved to family resources. When his family tried to stop the spending, they threatened the relationship Grant built in his head. And when they threatened the relationship, they also threatened the identity Grant had built around it. Although I'm not saying that this is an independently proven psychological conclusion, I am seeing this connection as an interpretation of Grant's conduct or behavior based on what was reported. Because his family knew the truth about him and demanded accountability. The online relationship allowed him to remain inside the identity he wanted to project. Grant did not simply present Silvie with money. He presented her with a version of himself. A successful man, a generous man, a man capable of spending thousands of dollars without concern. That identity was borrowed. It was built with Cody's money, Chad's credit, Margaret's trust. A family home Grant did not own. A professional status he had already lost. Once the family discovered the truth, the identity began collapsing. Treatment may have threatened it. The rules may have threatened it. The loss of access to Silvie threatened it. Being expelled from the house threatened it. We cannot know precisely what Grant thought during the final confrontation. One possible interpretation may be that the family was forcing him to confront who he had become without the performance. Unemployed, financially dependent, exposed, someone who is responsible for immense losses, and someone who is unable to continue purchasing the tension around which he had reorganized his life. Millions of people experience humiliation without becoming violent. Millions of people suffer career failure, rejection, addiction, debt, and exposure without harming anyone. Those experiences do not cause murder. The relevant issue is how a person chooses to respond when the image he has created can no longer be sustained. The prosecution interpreted the murders as an attempt to preserve the life and identity Grant had built through deception. The jury concluded that Grant committed the killings, although it did not determine his private psychological reasoning. Whenever violence follows an ultimatum, people ask whether the boundary should have been handled differently. Should have Chad expelled Grant earlier? Should the family have reported the thefts? Should they have removed every firearm from the home? Should they have refused to let him return after treatment? Should they have recognized the danger? Those questions may help improve future safety planning, but they should not become statements that point to blame. The family made extraordinary efforts to help Grant. They chose not to report conduct that could have exposed him to criminal charges. Chad accepted severe financial losses. Cody reportedly offered to repay relatives. Margaret let Grant use her phone to contact Silvie again. They arranged professional treatment. They established rules. And they gave him another opportunity to remain at home. The problem was not that they failed to love him enough. Jason's words make that clear. Nobody loved you any more or any less. Maybe the real issue was that their love could not make Grant accept accountability. No family can rescue an adult indefinitely if that adult continues using the rescue to avoid change. The alleged staging may be the most revealing part of the prosecution's case. Before the murders, Grant had maintained one false story. He was financially successful, generous, and could afford the attention he purchased. After the murders, prosecutors argued that he created another, that Cody killed the family. Grant was the brother who happened to survive. Both stories serve the same purpose. They removed Grant from responsibility. The first concealed where the money came from. The second allegedly concealed where the bullets came from. The first required his family to keep paying. The second required them to remain permanently silent. If the staging had worked, Cody would have carried the blame. Grant could have continued as the grieving survivor. The family's financial records might never have been examined with the same intensity. That is what staging attempts to control. Not only the crime scene, but also the future memory of the people inside it. The most marketable version of this case is obvious. A foreign webcam model, $200,000, and an execution-style family murder. Those details naturally attract attention, but if they become the entire story, Chad, Margaret, and Cody disappear again. Margaret was not merely a body at a desk. She cared for mistreated horses and introduced neighborhood children to something she loved. Chad was not merely a bank account and a fingerprint. He was a pharmacist, a football fan, and a father who absorbed financial damage in an effort to protect his son. Cody was not merely the body beside the gun. He was Grant's older brother, his weightlifting teammate, gaming companion, the person who traveled with him to Japan, the person he followed into nursing, and the person who reportedly offered to pay debts Grant had created. The most cruel part of the alleged staging was that it tried to transform Cody's closeness to Grant into an opportunity to blame him. Telling the story responsibly means refusing to let that attempt succeed. At the end of the interrogation, Jason told Grant, "Nobody loved you any more or any less." Those words should remain at the center of how this case is remembered. Chad, Margaret, Cody had shown their love through sacrifice. They absorbed losses. They tried to resolve the thefts privately. They arranged treatment. They allowed Grant to return home under strict conditions. They continued trying to help him after the trust had already been broken. Silvie's attention, by contrast, existed within a commercial exchange. That does not make it fraudulent, more like suspicious. But it does not make her responsible. But it does mean that the connection Grant experienced as romantic was tied to his ability to keep paying. And this is the paradox. Grant was surrounded by people whose love had already been proven. Yet prosecutors argue that he destroyed them to preserve a relationship whose intimacy depended upon money and an identity built through deception. Perhaps he was not truly choosing one woman over 3 family members. Perhaps he was choosing between 2 versions of himself. The version known by his family, unemployed, dependent, exposed, and the version he presented online, affluent, generous, desired, in control. His family demanded that he surrender the performance. The online relationship allowed him to continue it. According to the prosecution, when Chad, Margaret, and Cody became the final barrier between those 2 identities, Grant stopped seeing them as the people who loved them. He began seeing them as the people destroying his world. That perception did not make the murders inevitable. It did not remove his agency. And it did not make his family responsible for setting boundaries. The jury concluded that Grant chose to kill them. So the final tragedy is not that Grant mistook attention for love. It is that he rejected love when it required honesty, while clinging to attention that allowed him to remain inside a lie. Chad Amato, Margaret Amato, Cody Amato. They were not obstacles. They were not enemies. They were the people who knew the truth about Grant and still tried to bring him home. And perhaps that was one truth Grant's constructed world could no longer contain.